Like nooses.
Let's go and hang ourselves now. Is that working? Well, welcome to the Durbar Hall for a session on one of America's most radical and edgy artists, and who, at the tender age of barely over 30, has published her first autobiography, which is an unusual feat in itself, Drawing Blood, which is an extraordinary memoir and record of an extraordinary life lived as art and with art and creating extraordinary art in an intensely political and often erotic way. Let's start back at the beginning with your... Have we got the images, incidentally, working now? Could we have Molly's drawings on the monitor? So talk about growing up. New York, radical background, Marxist father.
My father, he is a professor of political science, but he's also a Latino Marxist intellectual who brought me up with copies of Emma Goldman's autobiography or with books about Che Guevara. My father was someone who, when I was a little kid, he would take my toy and he'd break it down to me. He'd be like, this toy, it doesn't just have value because it's an object. It has value because of all the labor that's been put into it. And the bosses can only get their profits by paying the workers less than the value that they give.
You were aged, what, 3 at this point?
Seven, I would say. And my mother is an amazing, amazing illustrator. She draws probably like I would if I was a better person. And she raised me to both think of art as like a blue-collar practical craft and also to kill all of my childish mistakes. She'd be the one being like, no, the sky is not just a blue line at the top of the page. You have to make it go all the way down.
And you really first started drawing, though, in Paris after school, on your first trip to Europe?
I developed my style in Paris. When I was 17, I had the opportunity, most amazing opportunity, to work at a bookstore in Paris called Shakespeare and Company, where in exchange for maybe a few hours of rather incompetent labor...
Describe the ambiance of Shakespeare and Company.
Oh, Shakespeare and Company.
It's the spiritual cousin of the JLF.
It's an English language bookstore in Paris. It was established in the 1950s, right out of World War II, by this amazing man named George Whitman. And it has, all the original edition of James Joyce, all of the great books, but it also had a motto. And the motto was, be kind to strangers, for they may be angels in disguise. And so because of that, he would invite all sorts of artists and writers and just sort of wayward kids like me to come and to live there.
And actually living on the premises and, yeah.
Exactly. There were bunks that were hidden below the books. And at that time, George was quite elderly, and there was something about it. It had this faded glamour of Miss Havisham's wedding dress, would be how I would describe it.
And people encouraged to sort of sit down and sort of move in and read the books as long as they put them back.
Exactly. And because I had a lot of time, because I was only working a few hours a day, I spent all of my time drawing. I just drew and I drew and I drew.
And this is right in the center of the city, near Notre Dame. It's the most gorgeous place. If any of you ever go to Paris, you will feel and enjoy JLF, you will feel very much at home in Shakespeare and Company. It's a wonderful, rambling place.
And George's daughter actually runs it now. George passed away a few years ago, but his daughter runs it in the same spirit of generosity and in the same spirit of radical eccentricity and devotion to beauty.
And they have a small literary festival, which I've been to once. And then, were you publishing your drawings at this point, or was it just private?
It was just private, and then also a way to hustle money. I was always completely incapable of being like a good worker, basically. And so I was always thinking of sort of scams to get money, or ways to get money. And one of the things that I would do was I would draw people's pets and children. I would, for money, I would like draw on the street, or else I would put up flyers at all of the little delis and be like, $10 and I'll draw your cat. I always saw art as this way that I could sort of carve a strange living for myself.
And the images that we're seeing now, with this very distinctive style, was that already, the origins of that already there in your...
Oh God, yes. Yeah. I mean, when I was drawing on the road at 17, I needed implement that even if I lost it, I could buy another one anywhere, even like a little desert town or something. And so I used pilot pens, and just simple rollerball pilot pens. They can look almost like
Donald
proper
Trump's
pen and
just
ink.
come up on this one.
Oh God! So shall I tell the story of this?
Quickly break from the narrative to tell Donald Trump.
When I was in Dubai I was in Dubai last spring doing an article about the repression of construction workers. These men that are building these great museums, and they're building the great buildings of the future, and they're getting paid like $150 a month, and they're being arrested if they strike. And so I was doing a piece, and I was able to talk my way into Donald Trump's press conference, and I found out that these guys that were building his luxury golf courses were making $150 a month. And because it's Dubai and because it's so censored, you're not allowed to ever call people on anything like that. But I didn't know that. I'm just a horrible little rude person. And I got up at the end of his press conference and I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Trump, you say that you're building the most luxurious buildings in the world, but the guys that are building them are making $150 a month. Are you satisfied with that? And I nearly got thrown out. I've never.
Did he reply? Or?
Oh no, he didn't reply. His mouth had shriveled really, really small because he's so angry. And then I was yelled at. They told me that it was not an appropriate question to ask.
Did you get close to that hair? Did you?
I did.
Take in the Trump hair?
I tried to analyze it. As an artist, I thought that I would have a unique insight. I could see sort of the tucks and wraps, but no, it's a mystery to me. I think some sort of great beast hides underneath it.
Is it a toupee? I mean, is it real? Is it?
It was really hard. I feel like maybe he has like one side that's very, very long, and then there's sort of like a basket weave mechanism around it.
Sorry, so anyway, back to, we'll leave Donald Trump, we'll come back to Donald Trump. And what sort of artists were inspiring you? I mean, when I look at your work, I see a lot of Ralph Steadman, the kind of jagged lines and the scratchy writing. Like
oh God.
My school copy of The Wall comes to mind, is it?
God.
Yeah.
I was obsessed with Toulouse-Lautrec, actually, the French poster artist who did the posters for the Moulin Rouge. And the reason I was obsessed with him was two reasons. First of all, I was a very awkward and unpopular child that really wanted to hang out with all the beautiful performers, and I saw my sketchbook as a way that I could kind of bribe them into liking me, and I felt that Toulouse-Lautrec was a kindred spirit in this because he would sit at the nightclub and draw all of these amazing dancers and beautiful, beautiful performers and actresses. But also, I liked Toulouse-Lautrec because every other poster artist at the Moulin Rouge drew it like it was just good, clean, wholesome fun. But Toulouse-Lautrec drew it like it was class war. He knew that those dancers, even though they were, like goddesses, were also, poor women who had clawed their way into having this one little bit of power for themselves. And it was a very tenuous and fragile thing, but they had, fought so hard to get that. And he drew them like that, like he drew them like warriors. And that's what I loved about him.
And so your next stage was not only to be inspired by him artistically, but to enter that world. I
did. So when I was in college, one of the ways I made a living was, at the time there was this very strange industry, which I don't think exists anymore, where basically amateur photographers would pay girls to like pose for naked photos, but I think that they just wanted a naked girl around. Like it wasn't really about the photo, but they wanted to imagine also that they were very sophisticated people who would never do that. So it was in part posing naked and in part catering to their own self-image, I would say. And that was my job during school. And I worked as a go-go dancer and a burlesque dancer. I ate fire. In the
book, you describe burlesque as vaudeville's disreputable sister.
Yes. Well, historically in New York, you had these like big vaudeville stars, doing all sorts of variety acts. But then you also had these other women who were, also singers and dancers and performers, but whose stuff was very bawdy and who perhaps couldn't pretend to be high class the way that like a Ziegfeld Follies girl would be. And so it was a sister industry to burlesque, but there was always a lot of dipping in and out. Like you would have a Hollywood star like Mae West who started in vaudeville, then went to burlesque, and then took everything that she learned from burlesque, all that irreverence and all of that anarchic spirit.
Talk a little bit about burlesque for those who may not be familiar with.
So burlesque is it started in England and then came to America. It's a tradition that combines striptease, singing and dancing with costuming and acts, and it's generally, the spirit of it is critiquing your betters, mocking them, dressing up as them, and showing everything that's silly and ludicrous about them, while also doing like an act that's sexy and bawdy as well. And it was, a huge thing in America in the 1800s, really up until like the 1900s, and then it kind of died in America as, basically as American culture became more explicit, it seemed less relevant. But then in the late 1990s, these strippers sort of found burlesque, old burlesque, and they mixed it with like performance art and drag queens and sort of like avant-garde performance, and they made something new. And it was something that when I was in my early 20s, it was this incredibly like anarchic, beautiful, glittery, tough art form that was being used to take on everything, and it was being performed in all of these dive bars, and I idolized the men and women who did it.
And drew them.
And drew them, yes. I worked as a dancer, but I was always a very untalented dancer. There are some people that are meant for that, and I certainly was not. But I did it in part because I could sit at the stage wings and I could draw these performers that I worshipped.
And what did it feel like the first time you went out and did a topless dance in front of a bunch of bankers in a New York club?
God, well, I wasn't cool enough to do the bankers. I was just working at dive bars. I mean, there's definitely, I wasn't talented enough to do that. But the first time I did it, I don't know, the applause crashes over you like a wave. It feels like a drug, And I remember there was this girl in the audience. She tried to grab my ankle because she was drunk, and I kicked her really hard. and then I was just like, I'm allowed to because I'm on stage and I'm a performer.
Yeah. And you worked at the Box.
I did.
Maybe explain what the Box was in its heyday.
So I have to explain what New York was in its heydays, or what New York was at this particular moment. In sort of around 2005, 2006, New York was so fat with money, and it was fat with money that was really gained through mathematical trickery on Wall Street. It was money that was built on air. It was money that was built on, like fraudulently assessed mortgages. It was the most ill-gotten gains possible, but New York was flush with it. And so this nightclub started called The Box that was kind of a temple to these bankers that were destroying the rest of the country. This was where they would...
This is where the subprime was building up.
Yeah, this is where the boys that built the subprime mortgages went to relax. This was a place where they would spend $20,000 a night on champagne just to show that money meant nothing to them. But it was also a place that had these stage shows. And the shows were the most brilliant, talented performers doing acts that skewered the audience. It was like class war in the form of a nightclub.
You described it in the book as mutual exploitation.
Mutual exploitation, yes. And mutual desire. On one hand, a desire for the performers, on the other hand, the performers' desire for cash. It was a place where the classes were rubbing up against each other till they bled, is how I would say it. I mean, one amazing performer did an act where she pretended that she killed an audience member and then put on his clothing and left in it.
Describe it a bit more.
So she's
up on stage.
She's up on stage and she's dressed as kind of a cartoon version of a sex worker. And there's an actor who's dressed like an audience member. He looks just like a banker. And she takes him on stage and she pretends she makes love to him. But then she cuts off his head and burns the bed that he's on and puts on his nice suit. She takes off, her sort of cartoon sex worker outfit, and she puts on his nice suit and she just leaves. And that was the sort of place it was. It was a place where you could actually, in this very limited capacity, speak truth to power, the way the court jesters always have spoken truth to power. And I think that's why I was addicted to it. And I was the house artist there, and I chronicled it night after night.
So was it being attracted to the kind of seaminess of it, or did you enjoy the edginess of it? What was it? Why were you there?
I enjoyed...
Why were you there?
Why was I there? Yeah. I enjoyed that aspect of class war. That's what I enjoyed more than anything. Because, when you're performing...
The solidarity among the girls?
The solidarity amongst the men and women who performed there, but also the way that you could say directly to their face. Because you could say, it's one thing if you're performing right for your friends, in a night... Like if I'm performing for you, this is a friendly venue, we like each other, and there are certain things that we say to each other. But if you're performing for your enemies, that's something different, right? That's a different space that you can speak in.
And the bankers were the enemy?
Yeah, they were the enemies. Yeah.
And this is sort of post 9/11, pre-crash.
Yes, exactly.
And this frothy bubble of money. And
this frothy bubble of money and self-delusion that was operating on every level, where New York and so much of America really thought that you could just build money on fraudulent math and air, and that you would never, ever, ever have to pay anything back. And then, in 2008, it all fell apart because it was built on lies.
And then Occupy Wall Street. Oh, that's later. That's what, 2012.
2011 was when Occupy kicked off. So after the financial crisis happened in America reacted as it always did, which was by doing nothing whatsoever for poor people or even middle-class people who had been, who had their lives ruined and their homes taken from them because of this, and instead offering massive bailouts to the banks that they then used to reward themselves for their own failure by giving themselves bonuses. They had hurt feelings and they had to feel better about it by giving themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there was a lot of anger in America because of this. And America at that time was not a country that really was given to street protests. There had been a lot of protests during the Iraq War, but there was a real feeling that at that time that street protest was futile, that it was theater. And even I felt that way, even though I had grown up very political, and even though I had spent so much time, as a young person, marching against the Iraq War. I still had that feeling too, that protest, it wouldn't work in America, that it just wouldn't work with us. The country was too controlled. But finally, and inspired by the Arab Spring and by the anti-austerity protests in Greece and in Spain, this protest was called in September of 2011 that promised it was going to occupy Wall Street. And I remember I went down to the first day and I thought that, sometimes I felt like I would attend protests before that the way one might go to church who wasn't a particularly religious person, where you think like this certainly won't do any harm, but I don't know if it will do any good either. But this group of people went down and they took over a square in Lower Manhattan, and they stayed there for 2 months, and they built a city, a tiny little miniature city on mutual aid, and every single day they went and they protested. And they were arrested and they were beaten, and they got criminal records, and they went down and they kept doing it. And because it happened so close to me, I started drawing it. And this was something that gave me the strength and it gave me the inspiration to allow my art to be political, because before that I was afraid to make my work political. I felt that I didn't deserve to. I felt that because I drew performers and I drew pretty girls, and because I hadn't graduated college, and because of all sorts of things, that I didn't have the seriousness where I deserved to stand in that space. But Occupy was a space for everyone.
And this also turned you into a published writer?
It did, yes. I got arrested at the Occupy 1-year anniversary. I was doing nothing brave whatsoever. I think I was arrested because I'm short, and the officer had a quota, and he thought that I would fill it rather easily. And it wasn't, a bad arrest as far as Americans go, but all arrests, I think, are somewhat traumatic. And I wrote a piece about it. And the reason I wrote the piece wasn't to cry and go, oh, boo-hoo, I was arrested. It wasn't that. It was that I think a fundamental sin that Americans have, one of our worst qualities as a country, is that white America, it's white America, views arrest and incarceration lightly. They view it as something that's, all right or harmless, and that you can just inflict upon people. And because of that, our country incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any other country. And particularly
yes, part of its black population.
Yes, it's black population and it's Latino population. And at the time in New York, there was a terrible policy that was called stop and frisk, which basically meant that police in practice would go up to young black and Latino men and grope them in the middle of the street, allegedly looking for guns or for drugs, but in actuality it was a form of ritualized harassment that often led to arrest. And so many smug middle-class white people thought this was just A-okay, even though it was horrifying. And I wrote this piece because I was angry about that, and I wanted to say no.
For Vice?
It was for CNN, actually.
Right.
And I wrote this piece because I was angry about that lightness that America viewed arrest with.
And that point, Vice picked you up?
At that point, Vice gave me a column, and I started writing personal essays about my life. Then in 2013, I was able to talk my way into getting security clearance to visit Guantanamo Bay.
As an artist?
As an artist. I was allowed to ask questions as a journalist, but I really just told them I wanted to draw pictures. I was the third artist who had ever visited Guantanamo Bay, and I ended up going twice there.
And as an artist, you could do things that photographers presumably couldn't do in a situation like that?
Oh my God, Guantanamo Bay is the most censored environment in, perhaps I think, one of them in the world. To play, or to take photos in Guantanamo Bay is like playing a game of Simon Says. The military is able to cloak everything that it does in this language of bureaucracy and this language of rules that they think makes it sound sensible. So they would say, oh, we allow photos in Guantanamo Bay, but you can't have anyone's faces, and you can't have this amount of buildings, and you can't have doors, and you can't have cameras in it. And then before you know it, the only photo that's allowed that they won't delete off of your camera is something pointing directly at the floor. But you know, they allow photos. It's not censorship, it's just security.
But as an artist, you could draw it.
Exactly, as an artist, I could draw it. And one of the things I very much believed as an artist was that I should, if I was being censored, I certainly shouldn't cover that up. I should make the censorship explicit. So I was forbidden from drawing anyone's faces when I was there the first time, and I drew them like that instead.
This is one of the Guantanamo.
This is the second time that I was there. They had this tour of the prisons that I want to call it like a Potemkin village tour, in the sense of the staging.
And that is a torture chair, is it? Or an interrogation chair?
It's a force-feeding chair.
Force-feeding chair.
So I would argue a torture chair, yes, though they would certainly not. In Guantanamo, the language went through this mutation. Nothing was ever called by its proper name. So when I was there was a massive hunger strike. These men were not charged with any crimes. They were never going to be charged with any crimes, but they were being indefinitely detained anyway. And so they were hunger striking because they wanted to get back to their families. And many of them were being force-fed, but the army refused to call it force-feeding. They made up a special term for it that I've never heard anywhere else, which was called e-feeding. And they took me to the hospital.
Sounds like sort of iPod or something.
Yeah, you know, e-card, e-feeding, it's nice, digital, you know. And so they took me to the hospital and they sort of justified themselves about why they were doing this. And one of the things about Guantanamo that was so horrifying to me is it's the most American sort of evil.
You write it's a uniquely American form of evil.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very cheerful. It's very self-victimized feeling. It's something that takes the tragedy that happened to my city, New York. It takes 9/11, and it turns it into a weapon to inflict tragedy around the rest of the world, and it rehashes it over and over and over and over again to make it into a cause to do anything. Guantanamo Bay is a place where one of the guards that I was interviewing told me, and I think he believed it, that in Guantanamo the prisoners had more opportunities to enjoy themselves than, quote, the places they were from.
But they're locked up in a cage.
Yeah, they're either in solitary cells or in something that resembles an American supermax prison, except much more dingy and grim.
And were you allowed access to actually to talk to the prisoners? Or?
No one's allowed access to talk to the prisoners. The one of the few ways that the Guantanamo says that it honors the Geneva Conventions is it says that it's not putting them on public display by forbidding them to speak to the press.
And you did interview the guards. What were they like?
They were very young. In America, very often, military is an escape for poverty from people because university is so expensive in America. Private university can be like $200,000 for 4 years in America. But if you join the military, you can go to university for free. So when you're talking with enlisted people, very often they're young people who are very poor or who are from poor backgrounds and who haven't really seen a lot of the rest of the world. And so they're propagandized to. They have the guards listen to audio tapes of people making those last 911 calls on September 11th in the towers, and dying of smoke inhalation. These are very propagandized to people who serve 12-month tours and then they go home. And there have been a number of guards that have actually become whistleblowers on what goes on there. There's a guard named Brandon Neely he actually went to England after several young men that he guarded were freed, and he went back to England to meet them and to apologize to them for what he had done.
And did you were able to see any interrogation facilities or not?
No, they did not. They did not let me see any interrogation facilities. Though I saw I speak wrongly. For the first few months in Guantanamo, they had the men all live in these outdoor cages that they call Camp X-Ray. These are like animal cages. And these...
It looks like a zoo, doesn't it?
And even more horrifyingly, these were not built for the Guantanamo detainees. They actually imprisoned Haitian refugees that were fleeing Haiti in the 1990s, were forced to live in these cages beforehand. So they have, a very grim history. And next to the cages, they had these interrogation shacks where the, worst things that were done were done.
Waterboarding.
Yeah, the waterboarding, the sexual humiliation, the beatings, the torture, the various means of torture that were done very, very often in these shacks. And I saw them, but they were empty and rotted over by this point, and there was this feeling of like nature taking it back. But that, of course, is utterly illusory, because 150 men when I was there were still in prison. They were still living this nightmare.
And waterboarding was still going on while you were there?
No, they weren't doing any waterboarding anymore. These men had been in prison for 12 years. They had sort of given up on any sort of intelligence value, which obviously, since most of them had none whatsoever, in the first place, because most of them were innocent people who were picked up based on bribes that we gave to Afghans. But still, to remain incarcerated by your torturers is a continuation of the nightmare, even if they've stopped doing that torture.
And this was for Vice, so what was the effect when you published this? The
military was very angry at me. The press officer called up Vice and screamed that
Could we keep the photographs, keep the slides going, please, on the audio-visual? Keep the pictures coming, yeah?
The military was very angry at me. They called up Vice and screamed that I made them look like tools, in their words.
But Vice loved it.
Vice loved it, but ultimately, I think what I hoped my piece did was it provided a very, 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 very small bit of the vast body of work, proving how horrifying and what a crime Gitmo is to Americans, because I think so often Americans, they have the most fuzzy possible idea of what it is, and even if they think, theoretically, we tortured someone, these people are locked up without charge, they don't realize who the people are in Gitmo. They don't realize that most of them will never be charged with any crime because they have not committed any crimes, and they don't realize the extent of what's going on. And I think that all the journalism that's being done there is so important. And also, last year there was an extraordinary book by a Gitmo detainee, he's still incarcerated, named Mohamedou Slahi, called The Guantanamo Diary, that reads like Alice in Wonderland filtered through the war on terror, especially because it was heavily redacted by the military. And I think the more that people who were and are incarcerated in Gitmo are able to speak with their own voices too, the more that you can fight against that. And you can fight not just against the Gitmo we have now, but Gitmos of the future that will be built.
And were there any models? You've been sort of building a career now which is unlike anyone else I know, in that it's political, it's got art, but it's also got words. Were you modeling yourself on anyone? Has anyone done this before?
No, as far as I know.
It's a new space, isn't it?
It's a new space. I definitely have artists that I admire. Like Goya, Disasters of War, or like Diego Rivera, I grew up obsessed with. And I have, of course, so many writers that I admire.
Does it have a term, what you do?
I say illustrated journalism, I usually say.
Right.
But I guess I just try to combine
art reportage.
Art reportage. Yeah. But I just try to combine these two things that I love so much.
So from there, next one was construction workers? What was the next one?
Then one of the next pieces that I did after that was I went to Abu Dhabi, and I spent quite a bit of time sneaking onto construction sites and going to labor camps and interviewing people that were building, the people who are actually building these, great buildings in these great cities.
Many of whom are Indians.
Yes, many of whom are Indians or Bangladeshi or Pakistani. And learning about their lives, learning about the ways that they were lied to, both by their companies the companies that recruited them and also the Western companies that employed them. I think the most important thing that I learned was that very often there's this lie that Abu Dhabi has and that Western companies and the Western institutions that work with Abu Dhabi have, which is that these South Asian men are perfectly happy to be exploited and perfectly happy to be abused and perfectly happy to get paid so little money. And that's not true. There are so many strikes in Abu Dhabi, and these strikes are done at such great personal risk and with such bravery, because it's illegal and you can be deported back, and you can be deported back with so much debt. And yet they still resist and they still strike anyway. And I think that it does a real disservice and a real lack of acknowledgement of their real heroism to ignore this resistance that's happening there.
We have another author coming this week, Hamida Habib, who's been working on this and working legally for the rights, and got thrown out, I think, of Dubai.
Which is, an astounding thing that she's doing.
Yeah. And this again was for Vice, so this is now becoming a regular thing with the illustrations and the text.
Exactly. I work as a contributing editor for Vice, but I also do it for a number of other places. This piece is actually from a series that I'm very honored to do. About a year and a half ago now, I started collaborating with a young writer who was living in Raqqa, which is the city under ISIS occupation, and he would send me cell phone photos. He'd grown up in Raqqa; it was where he was from. Like many people who stayed there, he stayed there because he was poor. It was always a poor city, and costs a lot of money to abandon your entire life and pay smugglers to take you elsewhere. And he was sending me cell phone photos of life there, and I was drawing them. And there were a lot of scenes that you don't usually see because they're not sort of like the lurid scenes of public punishment that the Western gaze wants. For instance, one picture that he gave me was of these little children that were digging through the trash to find objects to sell. And ISIS, of course, Daesh has this lie that they're providing these great social services, it's taking care of people, and these photos that he was sending were showing the truth, that in actuality, at the same time as they're murdering people, they're also impoverishing the entire population. They're living kind of as like a mafia.
And taxing them very heavily.
Exactly, yeah, stealing from them and stealing their homes as well. And so I started working with him.
How do you set something like this up? How do you get in touch with somebody in occupied Raqqa?
The internet, social media. He liked my work.
He was your Facebook friend? I mean, what happened?
Yeah, basically, some years ago, before that,
it doesn't happen to most people. I get messages from Raqqa on my Facebook.
Some years ago, he asked me to draw his avatar. He asked me to draw his avatar. He thought that he thought my art style was cool, and he was like, "It's my birthday, yo. Can you give me a drawing?" And I was like, "Yes, of course I'll give you a drawing, no problem." And we just kept in touch, and we had the same sick, sarcastic sense of humor, and that's sort of how we...
So this was pre-ISIS originally? That you got in
no,
touch
it wasn't pre-ISIS, no.
ISIS was already...
Yeah.
And yet he's able to chat away on Facebook, or...
They've always had internet in Raqqa, except until recently. The reason that people don't realize it, I think, so much is because most people in Raqqa speak Arabic, and so it was not quite as visible to the Western media.
And so you began this relationship with this guy you've never met.
Yes.
And he was sending you pictures, and you were then converting this into a piece. Was this for Vanity Fair, or was
exactly?
This
and then he's an extraordinary writer himself, and he originally started with captions, and then he started writing, essays to accompany this. And I think that having the voices of people who are actually just ordinary people who are on the ground, living through wars, is so vital. And so often that's crowded out by these I'm guilty of it myself, by Western analysts, and I felt very honored to be able to use my art to give him a platform, and also because he's an extraordinarily good writer too.
And tell me about him. What's his daily life like?
I can't talk about that because
it would. Right,
yeah.
Yeah. So what sort of stuff were you able to get out of this? What were the images?
We did images from Raqqa, from Mosul, and then also from Aleppo, which is not under ISIS occupation. That was just under rebel occupation. I drew things like the aftermath of a barrel bombing, these buses that were put in the middle of...
Again, maybe just explain what a barrel bombing is.
A barrel bombing, it's the government, the Syrian government, it drops sort of metal containers of TNT and shrapnel onto civilian areas, and
having run out of conventional ammo,
or just as as a means of indiscriminate killing. And he sent me many photos of the aftermath of one of those.
Same guy.
Yeah, same guy.
So he got from Raqqa to Aleppo.
Yeah, he got out, and I was honored to be able to do these things, and I felt that one thing that my art could do that was very important was a lot of images coming out of Syria. They're so lurid, they're like gore, and they take away people's dignity. And I feel that while there's all sorts of images are important, for me, I wanted people to keep their dignity. That was a woman who had just lost her home, And the pain on her face in that photo was something that, burns into you.
So at this point, you're sitting in New York
Drawing.
getting these things.
Exactly.
But then you went off to Iraq yourself.
I did. I was, in September, I was with Doctors Without Borders in Iraqi Kurdistan. I was in a refugee camp run by the UNHCR in Domiz, interviewing people who were about to make the very, very dangerous journey to Europe.
And this is Erbil.
No, this is, it's in Dohuk province, which is to the south of Erbil.
How did you get there? I mean, again,
We went, Doctors Without Borders, I went with them.
And flew in? Or?
You fly into Erbil and then they drive, they have, cars. It's, I guess it was about, what was it, like a 5-hour drive maybe?
And last summer, if I remember, Erbil, I mean, ISIS were still progressing towards.
They were about an hour away.
Yeah.
And, it's filled with, Kurdish military, Peshmerga. But
what was your impression of the capacity of the Peshmerga to resist ISIS?
I feel like I couldn't comment on that because I didn't spend so much time with them, except that they seemed very organized and very supported by the population. And also, I heard good things from the Kurdish people I spoke to about the capacity of the YPG, which is the People's Protection Units in Kurdish Syria, to resist ISIS. But it's not something I could speak to with any expertise. But what I did see was the economy there is ruined because of ISIS, because it's a very oil-dependent economy, and there was a huge construction boom.
There had been a big boom, hadn't there?
Yeah, there had been a big boom, and then the foreigners became terrified and they left.
Again, maybe just to kind of give a little background here. So Erbil is in Iraqi Kurdistan. It is effectively semi-independent.
Yeah, when you go into the airport, it doesn't say "Welcome to Iraq." It says "Welcome to Kurdistan."
And it's supplied out of Turkey. Everything is bussed in from Ankara and from eastern Turkey. So you have this sort of mini little Kurdistan that's not part of ISIS and isn't also particularly attached to the Iraqi state.
Exactly, and functions and runs, and it has been putting up a fierce resistance to ISIS for the last.
And regiments of women fighters too. Did you see
yes,
that?
I didn't see any female Peshmerga, though they're not the same percentage as in the YPG, but women do fight, and you also would see photos of women who had died fighting ISIS. Sort of celebrating their lives. It was definitely a place where you saw more women involved in public life and more very vocal women, and even I remember at this camp I was at, I was speaking to this older lady. She was chain smoking, and sometimes you don't see older ladies, in the Middle East necessarily chain smoke that much. And she just said who would dare tell me not to?
the tough people.
Yeah, she's a tough lady.
And if this isn't crazy enough, you then go over the border into Syria.
I didn't go over the border in Syria that visit. The one time I went over the border into Syria was it was in the summer of 2014. It was right before Foley was murdered, and before the journalist James Foley was beheaded by ISIS. And I went to a town called Azaz, which is just over the border, which had recently been, ISIS had recently been kicked out by a coalition of Islamist groups called the Islamic Front. And they had painted over the walls that ISIS had put their slogan on with hot pink and orange, and slogans like "There is no coercion in religion." And I also visited Bab al-Salam, which is its really miserable refugee camp that's just on the Syrian side of the border, that basically the only food there is 2 meals a day being supplied by the Turkish government. It's mostly women and children. ISIS would periodically car bomb the edges of it. And it was just a zone of real, this sense of just utter abandonment by the world in a humanitarian capacity. Saudi Arabia or Qatar would donate money to it, but then they would have this tent giving a small amount of things with their giant logo over it, advertising themselves.
I mean, we should say to the audience at this point, don't try this at home. Going over the border into Syria is not something warmly recommended.
No, even just over the border, there have been people who've been kidnapped and murdered doing that. Though
do you know Charlie Glass?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, Charlie Glass reported from Syria and went over that border several times. But by last summer was saying, do not go. It's the most dangerous thing you'll ever do. You will be kidnapped. You will be sold. You will be.
That was exactly what.
So why did you take the risk?
it's bonkers to do
because,
that.
because I could, and I felt like if I was going to write about Syrian refugees or if I was going to write about anything and I could, and I felt like it was relatively safe based on the journalists I spoke to and sort of my risk assessment, then I would be a fraud if I didn't, how could I have this opportunity to learn and to see firsthand and, assess it as being relatively safe and not do it, it would.
And did you just sort of dart in, take some photographs and dart out again, or were you sitting in the street like a Victorian mem sub with your watercolors?
I was drawing on the spot there, not in Azaz, because it was being bombed, and also it was not that sort of environment. It was very.
You were
tense.
actually drawing under fire.
No, I wasn't. It wasn't bombed when I was there, but it was bombed several times a week, and it just wasn't sort of
safe.
It wasn't the sort of place that I think, and also it was tense. People were very traumatized there, and it just wouldn't have been appropriate to do that. But in the refugee camp, I did sit around and I drew a lot of kids too. I always draw kids and give away my drawings as gifts and stuff.
And there's a lot of Goya in your work from there, isn't there? You can feel that sort of darkness visible that you see in his work.
I try to, and I try to. I think the through line that runs through all of my work is I try to come from a place of admiration. Like, for instance, when I was doing the work that I did about Abu Dhabi, one of the people I met was this young man. He was a young Pakistani man who was a construction worker, and he was brilliant. He had taught himself 5 languages, and he was so clever and so sarcastic. He's one of these people that if he had been born into a rich family instead of a poor family, he probably would have been a millionaire businessman, But because of where he was born, he ended up, as a construction worker there. But he was giving information to all of this media, not just to me, but to tons of different media, right under the noses of, right under the noses of the bosses and for this whole apparatus meant to repress that. And even though I couldn't say his name, obviously, because that would endanger him, I tried to really speak about him personally and his literary tastes, his views on the world, his sense of fight, because I feel like if you just come from a place of pity is corrosive. Pity, it's undignified. It's not. There's no equality there. You're putting yourself above someone, even if you say that it's good. Whereas if you can come from a place of admiration, that's where you can build solidarity and you can build equality with people.
And in this tour of the lovely places of the world, your next stop was Gaza.
Yes, I was in Gaza.
And also, I should say, at this point, learning Arabic and...
I can't speak Arabic. Anyone who speaks Arabic here, if you try to speak to me, you'll have a big laugh at it, about how bad my accent is. You're certainly welcome to hurt your eardrums that way. But I spent the last year studying. I can read Arabic.
And you've been doing translations of poetry?
For myself, terrible translations that no one else will ever read. Embarrassments to the translation arts. But yes, I was in Gaza because I was lucky enough to be invited to this amazing literary festival called PalFest, which is a touring literary festival of Palestine. And because I was in Palestine, I was able to get into Gaza as a journalist. And I went to a place called Shujaiya, which is a neighborhood that's very close to Israel, that when Israel invaded the Strip during Operation Protective Edge, they destroyed it. I don't think I've ever seen decimation like this before. They bombed it, and then they went in with tanks, and then they shot up the homes, and then they went in with bulldozers just to make sure there was nothing left. It was just gone. And people were living in the shells of their broken homes. And there was such defiance there. I mean, I remember on one wall of this building that had been bombed, someone had just written in giant, beautiful letters, "I love Gaza." Yeah. Or another man in the shell of his house wrote, "I'm still here." And if I had something to say of what Gaza was like, it would be that tension between having this, one of the most heavily armed militaries in the world, inflicting atrocities on it, and this sense of defiance to it, this sense of, I'm still here, I'm still standing, I still get up.
You yourself are half Jewish.
I am, yes.
How did that affect your vision of what you saw there? Did that?
I mean, I had never been to Israel before, or to Palestine before this, and my family has no connections to Israel. They've never visited it. It's, I feel like the sort of Jewish culture that I was raised in, it's this kind of commie, intellectual, Eastern Europe by way of New York thing. My great-grandfather was part of a revolutionary organization called the Bund that was actually an anti-Zionist organization. Unfortunately, it was something that was wiped out during the Holocaust. but it was very alien to me. It was chauvinistic and bigoted and racist and right-wing and religious fundamentalist in a way that was, I mean, frankly, horrifying to me. I'm when someone says, like, I deserve your house because God told me it belongs to me, I start questioning their
Reaching
perspective.
for your mailbox in your case. Yeah.
But I think that because I am half Jewish, I definitely felt that because in America, critics of Israel are so often attacked as anti-Semites, very unjustly, I felt like I should use my privilege for being half Jewish to speak about it, even though I, of course, am also attacked in that same way. Because
And how did it play in America? I mean, in a sense, America is quite happy to see atrocities in Raqqa, and they get published in Vanity Fair very easily. Did you find less receptive audience for stuff from Gaza or not?
I mean, Vice published it immediately.
Yeah.
Vice has always, I was not in no way censored at all. But I certainly was, I certainly got a lot of letters about it.
And accusing you of what sort of thing?
Just accusing me of, like, not being even-handed, I suppose, overlooking bad deeds done by Hamas, which was an unjust accusation, or honestly, just a lot of letters of lurid racist fantasies is the best way to describe it.
Anyone who writes on Israel gets that.
Exactly.
When I went to Palfest, I met an extraordinary artist called Dolly Salah. Did you meet her?
I didn't know.
She was from Ramallah, and 10 years ago, when the Israelis went into Ramallah, they sent the tanks into the middle of the town, and were making a point of deliberately driving in such a way that they would batter the sides of everyone's cars, take off the mirrors, leave dents in the thing, and do the stuff. And in some cases, they actually backed over cars and crushed them. And Dolly had a little red Volkswagen Beetle, which got completely crushed by a tank. It was flattened. And she made a construction, an artistic construction, an installation out of the crushed cars. And they had a big opening. And they had a party, and she put different kinds of music in each of the different cars. So one had a Quran chanting coming out of it, another had disco music, and so on. And anyway, they had a big opening. And that evening, the Israelis came back and reinvaded Raqqa. And she had a flat opposite the football ground where they'd put the installation out. And she filmed, which is the most wonderful film, the reaction of the Israelis when they came back in their tanks, saw this installation, and she said, the tank sort of stopped, and the sort of head popped out. Then they went out and looked at it. Then they all got out, undid their flies, and pissed on it. And then they came back, and they got into the tanks, turned the turrets towards it, and blew the installation up. And she recorded all this on video. And she said, like Duchamp, when he had one of his shows in Paris, but some of the curators dropped a couple of the images, and so they had cracked glass. And his reaction was, it's completed. Now it's the work it is. And her film is the complete work, as she regards it, of the destruction of a destructive artwork.
I mean, one of the things that strikes you in Palestine, but it's especially in Gaza, because Gaza is under a blockade, is this sense of people being cut off from the world. And actually, I wanted to make an invitation to the audience. There's a young man that I know in Gaza who works the theater troupe there, and he was looking for a theater troupe in another city, somewhere else in the world, that would like to be kind of a sister theater troupe to his and have a cultural exchange. So I know that this audience is very literary, and if any of you are involved in theater troupes, please speak to me about this. And I really encourage everyone also to read this amazing first-hand chronicle of the war called The Drone Eats With Me by a Gazan writer whose name I'm forgetting, but it reminded me of if Goya was a writer instead of an artist and he was doing the horrors of war, this would be what that book would be like.
We had Adaf Soef here a lot, who organises the Palfest, extraordinary woman, and so I think we've been running nearly around time. Quickly, next project, big show in New York coming up.
Big show in New York. So because I've been traveling to so many of these places, I terribly miss my friends. And my next project are these 6-foot-tall portraits of mostly of my female friends who I love so much and who inspire me. But portraits, that's standard. What I'm doing is, I never liked the idea of passive muses. I don't think anyone's passive. I don't think anyone's voiceless. So I gave them all paintbrushes, and they can write whatever they want on it, and if they think I did a bad job in the portrait, they can destroy it. Because I think that the most subversive thing you can do in art is to give up control to your subject.
And these are big images.
They're 6 feet tall, yeah. Bigger than me.
Well, I wish you great luck with that. If we have a big round of applause, please, for Marty Crabapple. We have time for a few questions, if anyone would like them. A beer.
A beer.
You combine art with text, which is something that I also love doing. And you write in your book about the transition you make to becoming a writer. And in a way, you almost elevate the writing because you see it as this thing, doing something that your art can't do. Now that you've done both, how would you think about the roles of each of these in your work?
Oh my God, I think I still elevate writers because since I've been drawing since I was 4, drawing is very natural to me. You know, I know exactly what I'm doing with it now. It took 28 years, but I've gotten the hang of it now. Whereas writing for me, every single time I stare at that blank sheet of paper and I'm like, really? Is something really going to happen here? Like, I doubt it every time. I think it's going to fail. And for me, writing is the harder but the more rewarding of the two. It's taking like the mess that's inside my head and clarifying it into something like hard and sharp and sensical. Whereas drawing, it's just like breathing for me.
Yeah, hey Molly. It's been quite interesting to know that you visited Gitmo. So I just want to find out how, your efforts, how have they influenced to finally shut Gitmo? Because President Obama, if you would be knowing, on the 4th of November, he had said that we'll shutter out a lot of prisoners from there. So any thing on that?
I hope, obviously, I'm hopeful that Obama will close it, but I'm also skeptical.
Why hasn't he closed it? Because he promised he would, and obviously personally he would like to. Why has it not happened?
Congress, because so America, something about America is America loves its fear. America has this strange dichotomy where they both want to be like the macho, macho nation, but also they want to cherish their sense of being endangered and their sense of fear. And so one of the things that Congress did that's very in keeping with this is it was like, oh no, we can never transfer these prisoners to the US mainland, even if they're totally innocent, even if these are like Uyghur dissidents who we know have had nothing to do with us, we'll still keep them in prison like for 11 years until, rather than transfer them to the US mainland because we're so scared. And most of the people who are still imprisoned are Yemeni, and Yemen is currently being bombed by Saudi Arabia and is in the middle of an extremely violent civil war. And but even before that, they had this notion that Yemen was like Al-Qaeda haven, and so they wouldn't send people back to it. And because they sort of ran out of other countries that they could bribe into taking prisoners, and because they wouldn't take them back to the US, they created the situation where these men were just stuck there for no reason, forever.
At the back here, lady waving her hand. Oh, this woman here. Next question for this lady. Wait, no, so give her a microphone, but let's have you now if you've got a microphone.
I'd like to say first that you've restored my faith both in New York and the people who come from there and your generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
But I'd also like to ask, those are very harrowing images, just the ones we've seen here. Have you ever seen or experienced something that you didn't feel you could draw or write about?
I definitely was sent photos that I wouldn't draw them. I feel bad about drawing bodies, I don't, though I don't have no moral problem with it. I just personally, I don't, and generally when I haven't written about things, I either didn't write about them because I thought that it was, would endanger someone, or else sometimes when you're dealing with people who are vulnerable and who aren't used to the media, they tell you things that might be interesting but aren't part of the fundamental story and would be damaging to them because they don't realize it. And very often I won't write about those things unless there's a very, 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 very strong reason to, just because it's not fair, you know what I mean? It's one thing if it's like a governmental press officer, but it's quite another thing, you know, if it's a sex worker in the Bronx, you know, who's never spoken to media in her life before.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you obviously have been in a lot of experiences which are quite traumatic, and I wonder how you keep yourself sane and not take in all of these sort of tragic stories.
Well, first of all, I mean, I try to remember that, like, I go home and have like a lovely apartment in New York, and I'd feel like a jerk if I was like, oh, I'm so sad. I mean, you know, I'm not the one actually suffering whatsoever, but I think I try to focus on people who I admire. That's like honestly one of the things that I do. I mean, even if people are being oppressed, there are people, you know, so many people have such fight to them, and you know, are so resourceful and have such solidarity and kindness with each other. And I always, I try never to focus on like the one-dimensional, you know, sort of sad story. I try to focus on how people fight back and resist and, you know, find their own ways, even if circumstances are terribly grim.
Wait for a mic.
Hi, Molly. So I read Discordia by Laurie Penny and you when I was 17, 18, and that was one of, you know, those books you read when you're a teenager. It was like, yes, this is what I want to do. This is gonna, like, you know, it just speaks to you very deeply. So in your work, your art and your writing, do you think about the effect that it's going to have on the readers, or are you just thinking, this is what I want to do, how do I do my best work? Or do you think about a particular impact that you want to have on people?
Sometimes now I think about the impact I want to have on people, especially I think sometimes there are narratives in the media that I'm frustrated by, and I think about how to counter them. For instance, with the refugee situation now, and I mean, I don't even want to say crisis, because I feel like, you know, freedom of movement is a human right, and we shouldn't frame people, you know, people moving as you know, a crisis, even if they are fleeing war. The thing with refugees, the narrative in America, they have two narratives. There's like either like, oh my God, ISIS invasion. That's literally how a lot of America thinks, or they think, oh, you know, the like poor, pathetic, you know, people. And I was frustrated with both of those narratives, and so when I would write about that, I would try to write in the sense of like, you know, human movement is a right that people have, and these are people who are insisting on individual destinies for themselves, amongst other things, and I would try to counter things that I didn't like and that I thought were simplistic and I thought were harmful.
Thank you.
Time for one last. How are we doing for time? Who's the timekeeper here? How are we doing for time? Yeah. Okay. We'll take two more then.
Impact that you saw on the movement like Occupy Wall Street, did it really have an impact? And is there a connect that's running through all of these, you know, that you see from Occupy Wall Street to the Gaza Strip to Abu Dhabi? Do you see narratives of greed and exploitation and, you know, all of those things? There is a connect, isn't there?
There is. I mean, and also Occupy, I think what it taught, not just me, but it taught a lot of people, was I think in America it felt like things could never change, like it felt immovable. It felt like this, because, you know, you're at the center of empire and it feels like, you know, this is just the way that it'll always be. And even though Occupy was crushed, just having stood up, I think, changed how people thought. It changed their spaces of possibility and what they could imagine in the world.
And a final question. Yeah. That hand over there? Yeah.
I really admired your work. I really loved your work. It was very relevant and hard-hitting, and it takes really so much guts to actually do this kind of work which you are doing. I just want to ask, for example, when you're at crossroads, for example, taking a decision to go to Gaza or Iraq, that is a very difficult decision in a person's life to risk. And when people are saying that don't go to that place, so do you ever question yourself whether should I go or not, or do you talk to some person who influence you or give a suggestion that you must do or something like that.
How do you make these decisions?
I mean, I actually feel like, as you know, the people who are really brave in all of these places are local journalists. Like, you know, the local Syrian journalists, the local Gazan journalists. You know, those are the people who they bear all the consequences. They can't leave. They are the ones that suffer the repercussions. And also, in my opinion, they very often do the most daring work for the least credit. Yep. And also, I mean, I don't know, I just know so many war journalists who are, I consider what I do nothing compared to them. Like, I've, you know, taken a few risks, but like, it's nothing. I mean, compared to like the courage of just, and also just like of ordinary people, you know, living, like just like an ordinary mom in Gaza has like more courage in like her toenail than like I do in my entire existence. So I don't, you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, a large round of applause for Molly Crabapple.
And I just want to say I'm so sorry. I'm so honored to be in Jaipur, and I feel just drunk on the beauty of this place. I feel like speechless by it, and so humbled, and also by this audience. And I just want to thank you so much for welcoming me. Thank you, and also you, William.